Hi everyone, I'm Paul, and this is tip 5 in my speech quality course. Communicate with pauses. So, what are pauses? They're short, silent gaps in speech. Why are they important? They help the listener process your speech. They break it into these small, logical parts that make it easier for the listener to understand your speech. They also give the speaker a short break. But the pause place and length is very important in speaking. Let's look at an example of a company outline presentation. I'm going to read the presentation. I'm going to try and read the presentation with no pausing. Have a listen. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to briefly introduce our company. For those of you who don't know us, we design and manufacture electronic devices, for example, smartphones, tablets, and smartwatches. We are proud to say that we now have offices in 10 countries and over 10,000 employees. Oh, I'm puffing. I'm exhausted. That was actually really hard. How was it? I think it was probably quite difficult for you to understand. So when should we be pausing? Well, you need to pause in logical, grammatical breaks in language. For example, where you would usually put periods or commas in writing. But sometimes this isn't enough. You also need to pause between other short clauses. For example, before words like and, but, so, and because. Today we're going to use this red dash as our pause mark. Now let me read the presentation one more time, but this time with pausing. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to briefly introduce our company. For those of you who don't know us, we design and manufacture electronic devices, for example, smartphones, tablets, and smartwatches. We are proud to say that we now have offices in 10 countries and over 10,000 employees. How was that? My reading wasn't perfect, of course, but I think it probably was much easier to understand than the first reading because of the pausing. So where did I pause? Here are the places that I paused. You notice they're in logical breaks in the language. These are areas where we would usually put periods or commas in writing. The last sentence here is quite long with no comma, so I've decided to put a pause here at the beginning of the projected clause and here before the word and to break up that sentence. Notice also that my pauses were very short here. Most of them, I think, are under half a second. We call this pausing, we call this language between these logical pauses thought groups. Sometimes we also call them chunks or chunking. The pauses are helping the audience process your language, but they're also giving the listener a short break to take a breath. Now, this thought group here is not at the end of an idea, so we call it a non-final thought group. This is not at the end of an idea either, so it's also a non-final thought group. Excuse me. This clause here is at the end of an idea. We call it a final thought group. You can think of the end of ideas as being places where we would usually put periods in writing. I'm going to read these final 3 thought groups one more time. I want you to listen to the intonation at the end of each of my thought groups. Do you notice any difference between the intonation at the end of non-final thought groups and final thought groups? Have a listen. We are proud to say that we now have offices in 10 countries and over 10,000 employees. Did you notice anything? You notice that my intonation was basically falling at the end of each thought group. This falling intonation was either partially falling at the end of non-final thought groups or fully falling at the end of final thought groups. This falling intonation at the end of thought groups helps to tell the listener that the thought group is ending. As we talked about in tip 3, the partially falling intonation in non-final groups tells the listener that we have more to say about that idea, whereas the final falling intonation in these final thought groups tells the listener that we have finished that idea and are moving on to a new one. Here's all the intonation in my presentation. I'm going to read it one more time and include the intonation, and just have a look at how the intonation is either partially falling or falling at the end of each thought group. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to briefly introduce our company. For those of you who don't know us, we design and manufacture electronic devices, for example, smartphones, tablets, and smartwatches. We are proud to say that we have offices in 10 countries and over 10,000 employees. Notice this intonation pattern where it's going like this. This change in intonation is creating vocal variety in my speech. Vocal variety also helps to keep the audience interested in what you're saying. We can also use longer pausing when we're presenting. For example, after important points. This longer pausing helps emphasize the point before it. The pauses are slightly longer though, maybe up to 2 or even 3 seconds. The key point, here's an example. The key point is this will affect sales. Now, let's look at our plan. It's also helpful to use longer pausing after rhetorical questions. This helps to engage or interest the audience more. What do you think entry strategy means? Let's take a look. We can also use longer pausing before changing stages or slides in our presentation. This gives the audience a chance to catch up with the information and process what they've just heard. So that brings me to the end of this section. In the next slide, we'll look at these pauses between stages and slides in a presentation. Also give the presenter a slightly longer break where you can check your notes or check your slides. So they kind of help the presenter too. So what are the key points from our pausing tip today? Pauses help the listener to process your speech. They help the listener to break your speech down into logical parts. So they're helping the listener to understand what you're saying. But the timing and length of the pauses is very important. They need to be in logical gaps in language. They also need to be not too long and not too short. Be extra careful with pausing in your presentations, because remember, you have to work extra hard in presentations to help the audience understand and process your information. It's especially important in presentation openings where you're also trying to engage and interest the audience. Here's something you can try at home. There are some good examples of presenters on my website. I want you to go to my website and go to the TED Talks on Language Learning page. Now you can either go to my website and search for this on the website search bar, or you can access it through this QR code here. Now scroll to the bottom of the page and listen to presenters number 6, 3, and 5. Just listen to the beginning, maybe the first minute of their presentations. Watch how they use pausing effectively to help the audience process their information and also help to engage and interest the audience. Next week, we're going to talk about focus words and how they can also be used to communicate meaning. And they also help to create this natural rhythm in English that the listener will be expecting. For more tips on language learning and teaching, visit my website at pomaka.com. On my website, you can also find information on online Zoom courses I will be starting on Sundays from this April. See you next week.